Good morning, afternoon, or good evening, folks. I'm your host and guide, Chris Roberts. I'm going to take you on a tour of the underground to help you prepare for what's really out there. Whether you're on the front lines battling the latest threats or leading the overall defensive strategy within your organization, my focus is to help you uncover the best ways, means, and methods to effectively and efficiently use actual threat intelligence within your company, providing you with more insights and practical ways to identify threats and reduce risks before they become incidents. Ready to dive in? Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Dr. Dark Web series. I'm actually doing the intro today, which is a little bit different because poor Danny has joined us. She is with us, but she is as pale as her screen is showing her at the moment. So she's got the lurgy. She's kind of dying off. Hopefully not too badly. She'll be with us. So send her good wills and all those good things. However, today we are joined by Edan, and I'm going to shut up for a second and let him introduce himself.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Danny. Nice to see you guys. So my name's Edan. I'm part of the Intel team at Cybersixgill. And, a lot of what I do, at Cybersixgill is work with customers to find the information that they're trying to find on the deep and dark web and across our sources. So that's kind of a high level of, one of the areas that I'm focused on at Sixgill.
Nice. Yeah, I'm kind of looking forward to digging into this. This is going to be fun because, we've done a number of episodes where we've kind of kept it high and fuzzy and fluffy, and now it's time to take the shovel and dig into this a little bit deeper and try to expose things. So I'm kind of intrigued to get your thoughts because obviously when we talk about the deeper side of the net, the darker side of the internet, we're not just referencing Tor and Onion. Where's your head when you explain it to somebody? Where's your head on exactly what we tend to look for?
Yeah, the truth is, I think sometimes I like using the word underground because I tend to think of it of like, what are sources that people are not typically utilizing? So, I think a lot of times, threat actors are constantly evolving, and that also means in new ways to communicate with each other. So I think, one of the areas where members of our team have done research on, for example, is that the increase in Telegram usage, both for threat actors interacting with each others, threat actors promoting their wares that are also on forums, data leaks. So there's a lot of areas also there where we're seeing increasingly more activity.
Yeah, now Telegram's an interesting one because I know when I was up to my eyeballs in it, we were doing a lot of stuff on like IRC channels, ICQ channels, and those were at least relatively easy to get in and out of because you'd have a bot, it comes in, it does a level of interaction, it records and keeps things going. Without giving the farm away, I'm intrigued. How are you capturing Telegram stuff and then looking at it and pulling the intel on that one? Because that's a whole different issue and challenge.
Yeah, I think broadly in the underground in general, there's various barriers to entry to get into different source types. So I think, you know, a lot of, a lot of good sources may require invite codes or member vouchers. However, with some, for example, somebody who's trying to advertise for maybe drugs they're selling or fraudulent related items, they might want to make it easy for somebody to access. That easy to access also comes with, I guess, certain pitfalls for them as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because if you're always behind a closed door, you can't sell your wares. Again, we go back to this, it's an industry. We go back to this idea that it's not just ones and twos and everything else. It's a machine. It's a very, very well-oiled machine. And somebody somewhere's got to do the selling and the buying. Talk about that a bit. I'm really intrigued on that from like your perspective because you see a lot of the transactional stuff go on. How have you seen that changed and evolved? And we talk about honor among thieves and all that. I'm intrigued on your thoughts on that side of things.
So, Chris, I think there's something to consider when we talk about these transactions. And let's paint the picture of who's generally operating on
Yeah.
the underground. And this varies. So, sure, you've got drug and weapons vendors, criminal syndicates, fraudsters, more organized groups, script kiddies, people that are there just to learn and maybe, start a career in certain illicit activities. But, on top of that, in a world where people are anonymous and don't want to be exposed, there's also plenty of impersonators. And I don't just mean the threat actors that are scam artists. I'm talking about law enforcement,
Yeah.
security researchers, cyber companies. So, that's something that I think a lot of these different, underground vendors have to contend with. Who's the person on the other side that I'm talking to? And I
Yeah,
think,
it's I remember, I mean, I've done a lot of work with children at risk and human trafficking and stuff. And we'll set up operations where, we have a room full of heavy, blurry, both male, female, and everything else, police officers and law enforcement individuals, and they are pertaining to be 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. And as terrible as it sounds, the in joke is like, 50% of the 15-year-olds you're talking to are probably 30, 40, 50-year-old law enforcement people.
so. I mean, I think with that, Chris, like in this world where things are murky, you don't know who you're talking to on the other end. You mentioned no honor among thieves. So in this
Hmm.
like world of anonymity where there's no honor among thieves, I think it's kind of interesting to maybe dive into like how is trust actually developed on the dark web, and how do these deals, transactions, relationships actually start where people are, could be concerned about being exposed, and, on the other hand, also maybe trying to earn a living.
Well, yeah, because I mean, it's one of those things where, I mean, perfect example is you go onto the open side, be it on any of the sales forums, and I know that I can transact with Danny or I can transact with you because you've got rankings. You've got enough people that said, "Hey, item arrived perfectly. Item was great. Shipping was okay," or "Oh, good grief, this was terrible." I know from obviously doing a lot of research on there, there's a very similar ranking and rating system on there. And to your point, even getting into some of those forums, there's elements of trust. And there's a couple I've been dragged into because of knowledge and other stuff and identities I have on there. But it's that ranking system feels strange, but it's necessary on that side as well. Back to your point, to understand the trust.
Yeah, so I think, we can think of this in several ways. Like, there's going to be various barriers to entry within different sources to develop trust. However, sometimes there's actually built in mechanisms, within different sources to enable that trust. Because I think, sometimes we don't think about it, but, these underground e commerce marketplaces, a lot of times they're sort of built in a similar way as a legitimate e-commerce store. So, you talk about reputation and feedback. So, an underground marketplace, let's say you purchased a physical good. Person that purchased it is gonna, say whether they liked it or didn't. They're gonna provide
Yeah.
feedback, which is viewable to all those other people, that maybe are contending between like, okay, I see two vendor, in the same way that maybe, you do this on, Amazon. You look at, say
Right.
two items that are very similar. What has more ratings, more
Yeah.
positive
Oh, yeah.
ratings?
Absolutely.
Um,
And the feedback and the users and all the other stuff goes with it. I remember the reverse of this logic. So in Colorado, cannabis is now legal. So I remember when it was first started, when it first became, it first kind of like came out of the shadows and the legalities. I remember seeing some of the websites and I'm like, hang on, I've seen those sites before. Went out onto the darker side of the net and I'm looking at the almost like a mirror image of the site. And it's like, it's really interesting to see it flow that way because, right to your point, normally it flows the other way. Somebody takes a rip off of, like to your point, Amazon or eBay or something along those lines. But it was a little bit flooring to see it come back the other way to the legal side of the world. But it was effective because it was all the different strains, all the different types, all the different locations. I mean, they had the entire mechanism on that side of the world. They just picked it up and went dunk onto this side of the world.
And I think, what is so interesting, and we talk about like, different food delivery services now.
Yeah,
When you don't get your food, or you don't get the correct food, or something's missing, what might keep you going back there, aside from maybe not wanting to leave your house? the customer success aspect. So what is that organization then doing to make sure that, something bad happened, but how do I make this person, come back? So, it's not just the feedback aspect, but it's also sometimes there's open aspects for people to actually have like arbitration or a discussion or bring forward,
Right.
hey, this didn't happen. And, the vendor might have an opportunity to correct their wrong or offer an explanation. So, there's not just the feedback system, but there's can also be like a real communication publicly. I think sometimes we see this play out. I've seen this play out on Twitter when people are tweeting at different airlines, for
Yes.
example, and then all of a sudden the airline works pretty quickly to correct it. So there's a lot of parallels between what we see, I guess, in the legitimate commerce world and then the illicit one.
Yeah. Now, here's the question: as you're building, and you do a ton on the intelligence and the data side of it, is that feedback loop, is that intelligence, can you get any useful data from those points? Can you start to use those to go down various rabbit holes to try to actually start correlating people, action systems, and stuff like that? How useful is that data?
I think it's quite useful because a lot of times with many vendors, a large surplus, how do you know who's actually has longevity in the ecosystem? How do you know, like, there isn't, sometimes with sources, there's a lifespan for different types
Yeah.
of sources. So, when one source gets shut down, a marketplace gets shut down, what happens to all of those vendors that have spent time establishing goodwill? What happens on a new marketplace? How do they prove that they are that same
Same
person?
identity over there.
And Chris, how do those like customers then, continue going to that vendor on another source? So, there's several ways to do this. And, one way I think is, sometimes it could be keeping a similar alias or the contact information is correct. One of my other colleagues has done research on PGP, and encryption methods to send messages where, that will be tied to specific users. Now, Chris, I'll caveat this in which there could always be somebody on law enforcement that's operating that in the end. But I think I've even seen, for certain sources, like an admin does a check-in, at a certain, a check-in every day or a check-in on
Yeah.
certain times just to establish like the fail-safe. Like if I don't answer, maybe consider pulling your funds from this source because we've been compromised.
Yeah, I've actually seen a couple of those. I've seen a few of the zero-day exploit type forums come up and down that way. And it's interesting though, to that point. So, I mean, Conti is obviously probably the most prominent of those situations now because of the exposure and some of the insider issues that happened. But I mean, we morphed from a very, very underground side of, counter security, adversary type of activities into now almost a slightly public side of it because of obviously the ransomware. And it's gone kind of crazy because I always remember doing a lot of this work only on the darker side of stuff on the channels. Now most of them have got flipping publicly, normally accessible address spaces because that's where they're transacting the business. It's a change.
I think every organization wants to have their own version of PR, and whether that's in the case that you're giving, for the ransomware leak sites, for example, that this could be viewed as, if you don't pay me for my data, I'm going to expose it. Okay, you didn't pay me, I'm going to expose this. What does that messaging do for the future victims? How is this utilized also during negotiations? But I think, on the PR aspect, and just tying this back to trust, we talked about the marketplaces, that open feedback, an open feedback loop, but there's also, there's also processes in place for the actual transaction bit. This would be like, this, I found this pretty interesting, but, a lot of services, they have, your you're sending your money to somebody that you don't know, you've never met, you don't know where they are. Escrow services, middleman
I'd
services.
seen some of that on the I've seen some of that. There's the wiki, there's the underground wiki stuff. And I've seen like the number of those escrow services like grow. And that's again, it's somewhat astounding, but it isn't because it works on the open side. So why not take a similar model on the other side of the world? Yeah, that's
I,
interesting stuff.
I often think like, okay, you're already operating, an illegal marketplace. One of the trust factors that you can provide is that middle ground for somebody to send their money to.
Yeah.
Once the product is released or however they decide it, then it will go. I mean, the benefit to the, I guess, to the administration of the marketplace or forum is, aside from the financial aspect, that they're getting a couple points off the deal, but they also want to encourage people to
Yeah.
actually transact there. The more transactions, the more credibility, the more everybody is happy.
Well, it almost adds a level of legitimacy to the whole thing. It's kind of interesting because now you're taking it out of the shadows. I mean, it's in the shadows, but you're taking it out of the complete shadows, and you're bringing to your point a level of legitimacy to it, even if it is. I mean, at that point, now you are establishing honor among certain thieves, and it's business. I mean, I think the other part of this as well is there's so much money flowing that they have to be more effective at how it's going. Unfortunately, we're still getting hit 7 different ways from Sunday, 6 ways from Sunday, whatever the saying is, and we're not effective at slowing it down. So the volume of traffic and the volume of money coming through is just ridiculous.
You hit the nail on the head. You said like business. And I think, it's important to view these relationships among anonymous people. Like a lot of people, maybe not the scammers, they want to have a long-term cooperation. Whether it's, okay, this is the vendor I buy drugs from, this is who I'm buying hacking tools for, I've purchased data from this person before, it has helped me for reconnaissance, for my attacks. So this aspect where, okay, what about a new person joins a source? How does that work for them, which is something I've always thought interesting. So we've got the escrow aspect, but what
Yeah,
about the guarantor? What about somebody who will vouch for you?
that's the interesting one. That's and having been and worked in a number of those forums is definitely an interesting side of the world because I know when we used to do a lot of them, heck, we're doing a lot of it now, unfortunately, because of the conflict over in Europe, is a lot of us are working together as a team. And some of us have come together for the first time. And so there's that element of like, hey, I'm going to hand this to you, make sure you use it right, and all these other things that are going on. So there was a movie years and years ago with Sean Connery in it. And it was that,
It's
fried
not The
them.
Rock, is it? Because that's a
No,
classic.
it was the other one. There was one, it was where they were stealing. It's the Y2K one. Do you remember there was one they did over Y2K and it was actually finalized in Taipei and it was with Catherine Zeta-Jones. And they were both master thieves. And it was first we try, then we buy it. And I mean, I've seen a lot of that where we'll bring somebody in and we'll work with them. We're like, okay, there's an element of trust there. They know what they're doing. They're not gonna go crazy. And there's, we've been able to transact something. And then you bring them in a bit more. And eventually, like, okay, now I bring you in. The same thing we do in the real world. It's not many of us will instantly go, you're my friend, and I'm going to cuddle you and hug you and introduce you. No, we're gonna work this out first.
So I think how we sometimes see this played out on the underground, especially, relating to somebody that's selling, data leaks, for example, they'll provide some sample data either publicly or when they're engaged with somebody that they view as a legitimate buyer. And sometimes, a legitimate buyer would mean, A, they could be a known entity on the source. Somebody else has vouched for them before, or they've maybe done something to show, a resume.
Do you remember when Pastebin used to have the more open style forums that you could search and everything else? And Pastebin, you'd have it on Pastebin all the time. There'd be people going, hey, I've got a card dump of X and here's basically a sample. they drop like 2 or 3 or 5 different samples, yeah, an Amex sample, Discover, and a couple of others. It's almost that, but a little bit more targeted. We've done it with a couple of the breach databases, unfortunately. We've done negotiations. I'm like, it's almost that proof of life, as terrible as it sounds when you're negotiating humans. It's that I need proof of life. I need proof that you were into that company. Show me something.
Exactly. And I think what's also interesting when we talk about like legitimate businesses, where you're joining an organization, there might be a background check. There
Yes.
might be a technical, for technical roles, there might be a technical
Yes.
assignment, a presentation, all things that we
Yes.
love to do during interview processes. What's kind of like, on that trust aspect, what I think is like wild is that, different threat actor groups will actually have job postings. The
Right.
job posting will list a bunch of parameters, including sometimes like what are the different compensation type packages, which are based on percentages, what they need, and then possibly a technical assignment. There's
Yeah.
always certain caveats depending who you're dealing with, so a lot of times we'll see we only accept certain language speakers.
Yeah.
You are somebody that's, you can't target these areas, and when I say these areas, it's usually one's talking about not targeting Russia, the CIS countries,
Yeah.
um, as well. So, the idea of a job application. I mean, there's no shortage of people offering their services for,
Right.
hacking or whatever it is. But sometimes seeing these job application descriptions is very interesting. And again, it mirrors what could be done in the real legitimate world. And it also makes you think, wow, a lot of people that are actually applying, you know, for these jobs, they could probably have a great career in a legitimate line of work, but maybe due to circumstance, geography, other issues, that's not that's not always a possibility.
Yeah. I some of the more memorable ones were from the hacktivism sites. So those were absolutely fantastic because I mean, I remember reading the descriptions and some of them wanted very, very targeted stuff. Some of them wanted, just general hacktivism activities. And it was literally that entire gamut. To your point, it was everybody from, hey, we need somebody to do the admin to run the mail. We need a couple of folks to do the language work for us. And I think this is something we need to probably touch on as well is years ago, if you wanted to break in somewhere, you had to do your own recon, do your own analytics, build your own tools, run your own attack vectors, get the data exfiltrated effectively, process the data, and then work out how to transact and basically make money off of it.
So
Nowadays, that entire thing's changed.
So we can think of this in in some kind of attack. There's various steps along that attack, whether it's reconnaissance, initial access, data encryption, exfiltration, communication with, the organization that's been affected. But ultimately, I mean, you can use the word affiliates or partners, but ultimately, different aspects of an attack cycle could be outsourced in the same way that, legitimate organizations, outsource different parts of their, of their company.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting. It runs even though it's a business, it's almost that startup mentality. It's, "Hey, we need an HR function. Well, great, let's go get an or we need a payroll function. We need our email function." And, we use the cloud so effectively these days. Some use it effectively. We use the cloud relatively effectively these days, and it's the same kind of attitude, except less cloud and more, to your point, more affiliates.
I think of it, Chris, as like everybody has their own expertise. I think of this kind of advertisements that, I've seen a lot of is everybody's received like a phishing phone call, somebody asking for something. Alongside that phishing phone call, there's a good chance that it's part of a call center that looks
Yeah.
like a legitimate of work where people are advertising for those on the underground, where people would advertise, for example, hey, I'm looking for, for example, British accent and American
Yes.
access. I need a female, I need a German female accent. So, we see these different things where, Okay, you might be able to write the greatest phishing email where then you want somebody to call you. The person that maybe crafted that phishing email, embedded an attachment or a URL in there, might not be the same person that's answering the phone call. So, we look at it like wide spectrum, just how different organizations are separated. A support ticketing team, a finance team, it could also be separated, in these ways.
The one I saw come up a couple of years ago, which I'm seeing more and more of, and it was the irony of the whole thing is you used to be able to spot like the what we call the 419 scams, we call them Nigerian scams, the print scams. I'm escaping, I've got this, I'm a banker and I've gone rogue and I got millions. Those were used to be really, really easy to spot because the language was terrible. Well, over the years, we've seen more and more language translations, more and more people coming up and saying, hey, I've got you covered. I'll actually template this effectively. I'll put it in the native tongue. So, seen a ton of that come up over the last couple of years.
So exactly on that point, Chris, on the okay, you recognize certain syntax and they're like, okay, this person like did Google Translate, but an entrepreneur on the underground, like native English speaker, for
Yeah.
example, they can offer those services, and they're plentiful. These aren't like a unique. I'm not giving unique examples here either, but again, we think about the supply chain of a legitimate organization. How is this also outsourced on the underground? And then how do you actually make sure that each element of your attack cycle, isn't compromised, is not going to run out on you, is going to be a long-term partner, and that is a real, that can prove to be a real challenge when you have law enforcement, on your tail.
So I assume, I mean, as we talk about it, we take a step back and go, look, we need to gather intel. I mean, we're obviously able to look at this and see this, but for me, just like on a legitimate side of the business, I'm not just going to go after the company itself. I'll look at its supply chain. For me, when you're gathering intelligence and information to turn into usable, actionable intelligence, you would be able to go after this entire supply chain and see where you can pull data points from, try to correlate it, try to see who's maybe getting attacked, try to see what language, what locations and stuff like that. I mean, is that a viable area and a viable focus?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times, when we look at different attack cycles, if you have an idea, um, maybe you have, some understanding of, for example, there's a certain vulnerability that's being exploited, that is utilized by certain groups. So focusing on that might end up, putting a halt within that attack cycle. I think where oftentimes there's a struggle is the it's always the human element, reminding people not to click on URLs, to have good OPSEC, but sometimes threat actors slip and they don't have good operational
Yes.
security. And I think a lot of times people ask like, well, can you tell geographically, like, where is this person? They're anonymous, they don't want to be found. Sometimes there's slips of the tongue, certain slang that is utilized. Sometimes also people could be sharing Gmail, WhatsApp numbers. I mean, Gmails can be subpoenaed. There's certain contact information that might be shared, which can then lend to more human intelligence driven operations. But I think we can learn a lot just by tracking, the public conversations,
Hmm.
um, that are being done, whether it's somebody's a malware as a service operator, for
Yeah.
example. They want to have open lines of communication. So they're actually providing update, just like, we've got Microsoft updates, different vendors providing updates. They're providing updates on their own capabilities. Now we're also able to steal logins from Mozilla browser, for example, whatever it might be. So that's kind of another area that I've found interesting that's also mimicking legitimate organization product updates, for example, where we can learn a lot from those as well. And that's why it's important to track those items to see like what's new. Oh, this person hasn't posted updates anymore. What are people saying? about this, service. Again, that feedback loop.
Yeah, that's huge. And I'll apologize. There's a noise in the background. We're trying to figure out what it is, but we'll get there. Hopefully, it's not too drastic on this one. Bits of the house are about to explode. We haven't got the still running, so at least I know it's not the still that's about to blow up in us.
That's good.
So it's a good thing, talk about underground stuff. All good fun. Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting conversation. And I think people are getting it to some degree. They're understanding that it's more of a business. They're understanding a lot of this. They're getting it. And from our standpoint, from the investigation side, it does allow us to start to track and become more effective. However, I think there's still a ton of education and a ton of things we probably need to do to help people really realize that, and I'm going to target you versus I'm going to target somebody else. It's all numbers at the end of the day. And it's all, unfortunately, we still have too many ways that we can target individuals and corporations.
I know, but I think sometimes if, maybe if we have the understanding that some of these organizations are actually working like real corporate
Yeah.
structures, I think we've talked before, Chris, about the facade of like the hacker, like in a hoodie by
Yeah.
themselves, that doesn't really always pan out because, when we talk about the motivations of threat actors, you mentioned the, anonymous campaigns ideologically, I guess we can maybe break it up into two buckets: ideologically driven and financially
Yes.
motivated.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
um, so I mean, I think with like the financially motivated threat actors, there's a focus, and yes, sometimes ideological and financial can certainly overlap, but on the financially motivated threat actors, you might want to have longevity with your partners or your tools, because just like a software that you purchase, there's some update and something doesn't work. So what do? You talk about it in the same way that, okay, you purchase a hacking tool that's pulling all the logins, from machines that you've infected, but something isn't working or it's not pulling everything. You've paid money for it. You're paying a monthly fee. You want to make sure it works. That vendor wants to make sure it works. So there's that joint need as well to have a success.
I remember, how many years are we going back now when Zeus and SpyEye were heavily, heavily utilized. I mean, we're going back several years. But those are probably two of the most well known from a couple of years ago that went after the financial systems. And that was a subscription system, and they kept that up to date on a really, really regular basis for a period of time. Very, very effective.
On like the different services to utilize across an attack cycle, or have bulletproof hosting providers. We're going to have, maybe folks that specialize in loading malware, the payload. There's all these different areas where, if you don't want to build everything your own, again, you can really lower the barrier to entry. You could you can pick and choose, assuming that vendor is willing to work with you.
Oh, yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. Man, I think we covered a ton of stuff on this one. We'll have to do this again. I think we need to do this again and dig into some of the other bits and pieces with you. I would love to dig into like languages and all sorts of other stuff on another trip, definitely. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Dan, thank you so very, very much for imparting a ton of wisdom. And we're going to be doing this again, definitely.
I enjoyed this as well. I think, we need to kind of break that facade of what the threat actor is, and maybe general leadership might be more willing to listen, or look deeply at the threats when there's an understanding of the deep ecosystem in which some threat actors are really operating like legitimate organizations, where some have, but I think we need to break those walls a little bit.
Yeah, I cannot agree with you anymore. I mean, yeah, I'm totally behind you on that one. It's part of the reason that this came into existence is to break down that mystery, the mystere and everything else. It's like, no, this is, as far as they're concerned, this is business. And it is what it is. Yeah, no, I loved it. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for shining a light on the darker side of the internet. Much appreciated.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Totally. And with that, we will wish Danny a speedy recovery and the rugrat that was running around, bless her. And we will see you on the other side. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Dr. Dark Web. This show is brought to you by Cybersixgill, the threat intelligence company. If you would like to learn more, please feel free to follow or subscribe to Dr. Dark Web on your favorite podcast streamer. Or, as an alternative, you can always find us online at cybersixgill.com/podcast. You'll find all the latest episodes, goodies, nuggets of information, background, and probably some stickers or two. See you in the dark.